It's the night of May 31, 1942. The roar of hundreds of aircraft engines echoes over the airfields of eastern England. One after another, bombers rise into the night sky. Heavy four-engine Lancasters, reliable Wellingtons, massive Halifaxes, and obsolete Hamptons and Whitleys. This is no ordinary raid. This is Operation Millennium, the first attempt in history to launch 1,000 bombers to attack a single target. This night's target is Cologne, Germany's third-largest city, located on the banks of the Rhine. 1,047 aircraft take off from dozens of airfields. This is an unprecedented concentration of aircraft. By comparison, the largest raid up to that point consisted of approximately 400 aircraft. Now, the RAF, Royal Air Force, sends more than 2.5 times that number into the air. It was an experiment, risky and ambitious. No one knew whether such a mass of aircraft could work together effectively, whether they would collide in midair, or whether this would overload the command system. The fleet consisted of 602 Wellingtons, medium twin-engine bombers that formed the backbone of RAF Bomber Command, 131 Halifaxes, heavy four-engine bombers, 88 Sterlings, another type of heavy bomber, 79 Hamptons, obsolete medium bombers, 73 Lancasters, the newest heavy bombers that had only recently entered service, 46 Manchesters, twin-engine predecessors of the Lancaster, 28 Whitleys, obsolete medium bombers. To assemble such a large number of aircraft, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command, was forced to use virtually everything that could fly. They used training aircraft, the same ones normally used by cadets. They used crews who had not yet completed their full training. They used aircraft normally used for other purposes: patrols, transport, reconnaissance. It was a huge risk. If the operation failed, the RAF would lose a significant portion of its bomber force. The bomber formation stretched 70 miles, 112 kilometers, across the sky. The aircraft flew at varying altitudes, a difference of approximately 4,000 feet, 1,200 meters, to minimize the risk of mid-air collisions. This was the so-called bomber stream, a new tactic developed specifically for this raid. The idea was for all the aircraft to fly in a tight column, overwhelming the German air defense system with the number of targets. Each German fighter interceptor could attack only one bomber at a time. If there were 1,000 bombers, the defense system would simply be overwhelmed. The plan was as follows. The entire bombing campaign was to be completed within 90 minutes. The bombers would fly in waves at 3-minute intervals. The first wave would drop heavy, high-explosive bombs, so-called cookies, massive explosive devices weighing up to 4,000 pounds, 1,800 kilos, designed to destroy roofs, pierce floors, and create rubble. The following waves would drop thousands of smaller incendiary bombs, which would penetrate deep into the destroyed buildings and set them ablaze from the inside. Arthur Harris, nicknamed Bomber Harris by the press, was a staunch advocate of area bombing. He believed that bombing German cities intensively and regularly would undermine the morale of the German population, destroy infrastructure, devastate industry, and force Germany to surrender. It was a controversial strategy, with both supporters and critics. But in May 1942, Britain desperately needed victory. By this point, the war had been going on for almost 3 years. Britain had held out in the Battle of Britain, but it was isolated. The USSR was fighting in the east, but the United States had only recently entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Ground operations in Europe were impossible. The Allies lacked the forces to invade France. The only way Britain could strike Germany directly was with strategic bombers. But so far, the results had been disappointing. Intelligence showed that previous raids had been ineffective. Only 1 in 3 aircraft dropped their bombs within 5 miles, 8 kilometers, of their intended target. Accurate bombing at night was nearly impossible. There were insufficient navigational instruments and no radar guidance systems. Bombers relied on visual navigation, using rivers, railways, and cities as landmarks. But at night, all of these were difficult to discern. So Harris concluded, if precision was impossible, area bombing was necessary. If a specific factory couldn't be hit, the entire city in which it was located had to be destroyed. It was a moral and strategic turning point. Until then, the RAF, at least officially, had attempted to bomb only military and industrial targets. Now the strategy changed. The cities themselves became the target, their residential areas, their infrastructure, their populations. The idea was to break the Germans' will to resist, to force them to demand an end to the war from their government. It was total war, transferred to the air. The initial plan was to bomb Hamburg, Germany's largest port and industrial center. But at the last minute, the weather forecast showed poor visibility over Hamburg. The target was changed to Cologne. Cologne was less strategically important than Hamburg, but it was a major transportation hub with important railway stations and several hundred factories producing military goods, including components for anti-aircraft guns. Furthermore, Cologne was easier to find from the air. It lies on the Rhine, which is clearly visible even at night. As the first bombers crossed the coast of the Netherlands and headed deep into Germany, the German air defense system began to react. Luftwaffe night fighters took off. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. But the system was overwhelmed. Usually, German air defenses effectively dealt with raids of 100-200 bombers spread out over a wide area. But now, 1,000 bombers were flying in a dense column. Radars showed a solid mass of targets. The fighters didn't know which bomber to attack. The anti-aircraft gunners fired randomly into the darkness. The defense system was paralyzed. At 0047, the first bombs fell on Cologne. A bombing campaign that would change aerial warfare strategy forever had begun. By early 1942, the RAF's strategic bombing campaign was in deep crisis. For nearly 2 years, British bombers had been conducting night raids on targets in Germany, but the results were disappointing. German industrial production had not declined, the morale of the German population had not been broken, and the Wehrmacht's war machine continued to operate at full capacity. Moreover, bomber losses were mounting, and their effectiveness was declining. In August 1941, the Butt Report was published, shocking the British command. David Bensasan Butt, an analyst at the War Cabinet, conducted a detailed study of photographs taken by bombers after raids. The results were horrific. Only 1/3 of aircraft dropped their bombs within 5 miles, 8 kilometers, of their intended target. In cloud cover, this ratio dropped to 1 in 10. This meant that most bombs fell in fields, forests, or residential areas, causing no damage to military or industrial facilities. The reasons were technical. At night, without visual contact with the ground, navigation relied on dead reckoning. Navigators calculated their course based on speed, flight time, and wind direction. But the wind at altitude often changed unpredictably. Cloud cover obscured landmarks. German air defenses forced the bombers to change course, take evasive action, and stray from their intended destination. By the time the crew thought they were over their target, they could be tens of kilometers away. Political pressure on the RAF was growing. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, was disappointed with the results of the bombing campaign. He demanded results, visible successes that could be demonstrated to the public and the Allies. The USSR demanded a second front in Europe, but Britain lacked the forces for an invasion. Strategic bombing was the only way to demonstrate that Britain was actively fighting against Germany, that it wasn't sitting passively across the channel. In February 1942, Arthur Harris was appointed Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command. He was a decisive and uncompromising man who believed in one simple idea. If precision bombing was impossible, bomb an area. If a specific factory couldn't be hit, the entire city in which it was located had to be destroyed. Harris was convinced that the massive bombing of German cities was the only way to break Germany without a bloody ground invasion. On February 14, 1942, a new directive was issued for Bomber Command, formally changing the strategy. The primary objective was now the destruction of the morale of the enemy civilian population, especially industrial workers. This was a euphemism. In practice, this meant that bombers were to target not factories, but residential areas where workers lived. The idea was that if workers lost their homes and loved ones, they would be unable or unwilling to work in the factories. Production would grind to a halt, and Germany's war machine would collapse. This strategy was controversial from the outset. Many RAF commanders objected to it on moral grounds. They believed that bombing civilians was a war crime and that it wasn't what Britain was fighting for. But Harris and his supporters argued that in a total war, there were no civilians. All Germans, from factory workers to the housewives who fed them, were part of the war machine. Destroying that machine by any means necessary was justified. Harris understood that to implement this strategy, he needed to demonstrate results. He needed a large-scale, demonstrative operation that would prove the effectiveness of carpet bombing. He needed something so large-scale that it would impress the public, politicians, allies, and enemies. Thus, the idea for Operation Millennium was born, a 1,000-bomber raid on a single city. The number 1,000 wasn't chosen at random. It was a psychologically significant number. Up until that point, the largest raids had involved 200-400 aircraft. 1,000 bombers was a completely different scale. It was something newspapers could splash on the front pages. 1,000 bombers attacked Germany was a headline that could change public opinion. But gathering 1,000 bombers was incredibly difficult. By May 1942, the entire RAF Bomber Command had approximately 400 to 500 combat-ready frontline bombers. To bring the number up to 1,000, Harris was forced to use everything that could fly: training aircraft from flying schools, coastal command bombers that routinely patrolled the Atlantic for German U-boats, transport aircraft, even obsolete aircraft typically used to tow gliders. Instructors from the flying schools were required to fly alongside their students. This was a huge risk. If the raid failed, if losses were high, the RAF would lose not only the bombers, but also the instructors, experienced men who were almost impossible to replace. The Admiralty objected to the use of coastal aircraft, arguing that it would weaken the protection of Atlantic convoys. But Harris insisted. He convinced Churchill that the success of Operation Millennium was worth the risk. Preparations took several weeks. Crews practiced flying in tight formations. A new bomber stream tactic was developed. All aircraft flew in a single tight stream, rather than in dispersed groups. The idea was that German air defenses would be unable to cope with so many targets simultaneously. Routes were developed that minimized flight time over enemy territory. Time intervals between waves were determined to avoid mid-air collisions. Hamburg, Germany's largest port and second largest city, was initially chosen as the target. But the day before the raid, the weather forecast showed poor visibility over Hamburg. The target was changed to Cologne. Cologne was smaller, but it was strategically important. It was a key transportation hub with major railway stations and industrial plants. Furthermore, Cologne was easier to find from the air. It is located on the Rhine, which is clearly visible even at night. On May 30th, 1942, in the late afternoon, the crews received their final briefing. They were told that this would be the largest raid in history. They were told that the entire world would be watching the results. They were told that the future of strategic bombing, and perhaps the future of the entire war, depended on the success of this operation. Thousands of young men, pilots, navigators, gunners, bombardiers, prepared for the mission, knowing that many of them would not return. The idea of area bombing was a radical shift in strategy. Until 1942, the RAF, at least officially, adhered to the doctrine of pinpoint bombing, attacks on specific military and industrial targets. This doctrine was based on pre-war air warfare theories that assumed that bomber aircraft could precisely destroy key targets: factories, power plants, oil depots, railway junctions, thus paralyzing the enemy's war effort without having to bomb cities. But the reality of war showed that this theory didn't work. Accurate bombing at night was nearly impossible. During the day, bombers were too vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. Losses were unacceptably high. At night, bombers could avoid fighters, but they couldn't accurately find targets. The technology of the time, primitive radio navigation systems, optical bomb sights, was insufficient for accurate night bombing. Arthur Harris concluded that if precision is impossible, it must be compensated for by scale. If a specific factory can't be destroyed, the entire region in which it is located must be destroyed. If a specific worker at a factory can't be killed, his home must be destroyed, leaving him with nowhere to return to after his shift. The logic was simple and brutal. Industrial production depends on workers. Workers live in cities. Destroy the cities, and production will stop. This strategy was based on several assumptions. First, that massive bombing would break the morale of the civilian population. Harris believed that if the Germans lived in constant fear, with their homes destroyed, with their loved ones killed, they would demand that their government end the war. This assumption was based on the British experience of the Blitz of 1940-1941, when German bombers attacked British cities. But Harris misinterpreted this experience. The Blitz didn't break the British. It united them. Secondly, Harris believed that the destruction of cities would lead to the collapse of the German war economy. If workers couldn't reach factories because of destroyed roads and railways, if they were preoccupied with finding food and shelter instead of working, if they were killed or wounded, production would grind to a halt. This assumption was partially correct. Bombing did disrupt production, but not to the extent Harris expected. The German economy was remarkably resilient. Even heavily damaged cities continued to function. Third, Harris believed that carpet bombing was the only way Britain could inflict significant damage on Germany without a ground invasion. In 1942, Britain lacked the forces to invade continental Europe. The USSR was fighting in the east, suffering massive losses, and demanded that the Western Allies open a second front. But Britain was unprepared. Strategic bombing was a way to demonstrate to Stalin and the world that Britain was actively fighting. A directive of February 14, 1942, formalized this strategy. It stated, "It has been decided that the main effort of bomber aviation should be directed toward destroying the morale of the enemy's civilian population, particularly industrial workers." It was a euphemism, but its meaning was clear. Bomb cities, bomb residential areas, kill civilians. Officially, the targets were still described as industrial areas or transport hubs, but in practice, the bombs fell on residential areas, schools, hospitals, and churches, and this strategy raised moral questions that were not resolved either then or after the war. Was it justifiable to kill thousands of civilians to weaken the enemy's war effort? Was there an alternative? Can Harris be blamed for a strategy approved by Churchill and the British government? These questions remain controversial to this day. Harris himself had no doubts about the soundness of his strategy. He was convinced that carpet bombing would save lives in the long run, shortening the war. He saw bombing as an alternative to a bloody ground invasion that would have killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Better to kill German civilians from the air than send British soldiers to die on the beaches of France. That was his logic. Operation Millennium was supposed to be a demonstration of the strategy's effectiveness. If 1,000 bombers could destroy a major city overnight, it would prove that carpet bombing worked. It would convince skeptics in the government and command. It would justify devoting resources to expanding bomber forces. It would change the course of the war. Assembling 1,000 bombers for a single operation was a logistical nightmare. By May 1942, the entire RAF Bomber Command had approximately 400 combat-ready frontline bombers. To achieve the psychologically crucial figure of 1,000, Arthur Harris was forced to use every available resource, often over the objections of other commanders. The original plan called for Coastal Command aircraft, which routinely patrolled the Atlantic hunting German U-boats, to be deployed. Harris requested 250 Coastal Command bombers from the Admiralty. However, a few days before the operation, the Admiralty refused. The admirals argued that the Battle of the Atlantic was critical to Britain's survival, that German U-boats were sinking food and supply convoys, and that diverting 250 aircraft to a demonstrative operation was unacceptable. Harris was furious, but there was no time for argument. He was forced to seek alternative sources. A solution was found in the Operational Training Units, OTUs. These units trained cadets for combat squadrons. They had training aircraft in which cadets practiced piloting and bombing skills. Harris ordered all OTUs to make every combat-ready aircraft and crew available for Operation Millennium. It was a huge risk. The OTU instructors were experienced pilots, many with combat experience. If they were killed in the attack, the RAF would lose people who were almost impossible to replace, people who would train the next generation of aircrew. The cadets, many of whom had not yet completed full training, would be sent on a combat mission. This was a violation of normal procedures, but Harris believed the end justified the risk. By 30 May 1942, 1,047 bombers had been assembled. The fleet consisted of 602 Wellingtons, reliable twin-engine bombers that formed the backbone of Bomber Command, 131 Halifaxes, heavy four-engine bombers, 88 Sterlings, another type of heavy bomber, 79 Hamptons, obsolete medium bombers, 73 Lancasters, the newest heavy bombers that had only recently entered service, 46 Manchesters, twin-engine predecessors of the Lancaster, 28 Whitleys, obsolete medium bombers. It was a mix of old and new, experienced and experimental. 58 of these bombers belonged to Polish squadrons fighting in the RAF. These men had particular reasons to hate Germany. Their country was occupied, their families murdered or enslaved. They flew not only for Britain, but also for Poland. In addition to the bombers attacking Cologne, another 113 aircraft were involved in so-called intruder missions, raids on German airfields by night fighters to prevent them from taking off and attacking the bomber stream. Planning the operation was complex. The main challenge was how to safely assemble 1,000 aircraft flying in the dark and direct them toward a single target without causing mid-air collisions. Traditional tactics called for the bombers to fly in dispersed formations, each at its own altitude and along its own route. But this gave German air defenses time to detect each formation and dispatch fighters to intercept them. A new tactic, the bomber stream, was developed for Operation Millennium. All aircraft flew in a single, dense stream, stretching for approximately 70 miles, 112 kilometers. The aircraft flew at varying altitudes with vertical spacing of approximately 4,000 feet, 1,200 kilometers, to minimize the risk of collisions. The idea was that German radars would see a continuous mass of targets, overloading German air defense controllers, and leaving fighters confused about which bomber to attack. Time was critical. The entire raid had to be completed within 90 minutes. Previously, raids had stretched out to 4 hours. But long raids gave the German air defenses time to react, redeploy fighters, and concentrate anti-aircraft fire. If 1,000 bombers dropped all their bombs in 90 minutes, the defense system would be paralyzed. Fire brigades wouldn't have time to put out the fires. The chaos would be absolute. The bombing plan was two-phased. The first wave, consisting of more experienced crews in heavy bombers, was to drop high explosive bombs. Heavy explosive devices designed to destroy roofs, pierce ceilings, and disrupt plumbing systems. These were so-called cookies, cylindrical bombs weighing up to 4,000 pounds, 1,800 kilos, that created enormous explosions but relatively shallow craters. Their goal was not to penetrate deep into the ground, but to destroy buildings above ground. The second and subsequent waves were to drop thousands of small incendiary bombs. These bombs, typically weighing 4 pounds, 1.8 kilos each, were designed to set buildings ablaze from the inside. After the high explosive bombs destroyed roofs and ceilings, the incendiary bombs would penetrate deep into the buildings and ignite furniture, woodwork, and any flammable materials. Thousands of individual fires were intended to coalesce into a firestorm, a self-sustaining blaze that would generate its own winds and become uncontrollable. On May 30th, 1942, in the late afternoon, the crews received their final briefing. They were shown aerial photographs of Cologne. They were explained the route, altitudes, and time over the target. They were told that this would be the largest raid in history, and that the whole world would be watching the results. Some crews were excited. This was an opportunity to deal a crushing blow to Germany. Others were terrified. Many of them were flying a combat mission for the first time. Around 10:30 p.m., the first bombers began taking off from airfields across eastern England. The takeoff lasted over an hour. The planes took off one after another, gained altitude, and formed a formation. By midnight, the skies over England were filled with the roar of hundreds of aircraft engines. The largest air fleet in history was heading for Cologne. The night of May 30-31, 1942. The crews board their planes, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio operators, an average of 5 to 7 people per bomber. A total of about 6,500 young people, many under 20. They bring good luck, talismans, photographs of loved ones, letters from families. Many of them are flying combat missions for the first time. Some will never return. Around 10:30 p.m., the first bombers begin to take off. One after another, the heavy machines accelerate down the runway, lift off, and gain altitude. The roar of the engines is deafening. The ground trembles with vibration. This is no ordinary sortie. This is on a scale no one has ever seen before. Bombers rise from dozens of airfields across eastern England, forming a massive airstream heading for the continent. The takeoff process lasts over an hour. The planes take off at intervals of several minutes, reach the designated altitude, and join the flow. Organizing this process requires precision. Any error could lead to a mid-air collision. But everything goes relatively smoothly. By midnight, most of the fleet is already in the air, heading southeast, toward the Netherlands, and onward to Germany. The route was carefully planned to minimize flight time over enemy territory and avoid the heaviest concentrations of German anti-aircraft defenses. The bombers crossed the North Sea, then the Dutch coast near Vlissingen, then flew southeast along the Dutch-Belgian border, then turned east toward the Rhine and Cologne. The entire flight took approximately 2 to 3 hours, depending on aircraft type and speed. The German air defense system began to respond almost immediately. Radar stations on the Dutch coast detected the approaching mass of aircraft. An alarm was transmitted to air defense control centers. Luftwaffe night fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-110s, and Junkers Ju-88s began taking off from airfields. Anti-aircraft batteries along the entire route were put on alert, but the system was overloaded. Typically, German air defenses effectively dealt with raids of 100-200 bombers, dispersed over a wide area and time. Controllers could direct fighters to intercept specific groups of bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries could concentrate fire. But now, 1,000 bombers were flying in a tight column within 90 minutes. Radars showed a solid mass of targets. Controllers didn't know where to direct the fighters. Each German night fighter could attack only one bomber at a time. If there were 1,000 bombers, the vast majority would escape without being intercepted. Nevertheless, some bombers were attacked. Night fighters hunted in the darkness, using airborne radar and visual detection based on silhouettes against the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries fired into the darkness, hoping for a hit. Searchlights attempted to illuminate the bombers, making them visible to fighters and anti-aircraft gunners. Several bombers were shot down on approach to their targets. The crews watched the burning planes fall into the darkness, but most continued flying. Inside the bombers, the crews were tense. Navigators calculated their distances, checked maps, and searched for landmarks. Pilots maintained their course and altitude. Gunners rotated their turrets, scanning for German fighters. Bombardiers prepared bombs and checked their sights. Everyone knew that the most dangerous part lay ahead, flying over the target, where the concentration of anti-aircraft fire would be greatest. Around 12:30 a.m. on May 31st, the lead bombers sighted the Rhine, a wide silver ribbon, clearly visible even in the darkness. This was their primary landmark. Cologne is located on both banks of the Rhine. The first aircraft began descending toward their target. At 12:47 a.m., the first bombs fell on Cologne. The bombing began. The crews of the first wave saw the city below, a dark mass of buildings with occasional lights. Then the explosions began. Heavy, high-explosive bombs exploded with a deafening roar, creating flashes of light that momentarily illuminated everything around them. Buildings collapsed. Roofs were torn apart. Water pipes burst. This was only the beginning. The first wave was followed by a second, third, fourth. Every 3 minutes, a new group of bombers appeared over the city and dropped their payload. Now these were mostly incendiary bombs, thousands of tiny fire-detonating devices that fell like rain. They penetrated ruined buildings, igniting everything that could burn. The crews of subsequent waves saw not a dark city, but a fiery labyrinth. Hundreds, thousands of fires burned simultaneously. Anti-aircraft fire over Cologne was intense. German anti-aircraft gunners fired from every weapon. The sky was filled with the explosions of anti-aircraft shells, flashes of light, clouds of smoke. Shrapnel flew in all directions, piercing the skin of aircraft, wounding or killing crew members. Searchlights darted across the sky, trying to catch the bombers in their beams. When an aircraft was illuminated by a searchlight, it became an easy target for anti-aircraft artillery. Pilots made sharp maneuvers trying to escape the beam. The crews were focused on their mission. The bombardiers peered through their sights, searching for landmarks, adjusting their aiming. Left, right, maintain course, release. The bombs separated from their mounts and fell into the darkness. The aircraft grew lighter, bouncing upward. Bombs dropped. Let's go. The pilot turned, picked up speed, and headed home. But the danger was not over yet. German fighters hunted the bombers on their return flight, trying to intercept them as they flew over the Netherlands toward the sea. Below, Cologne was turning into an inferno. The city was burning. Fire crews were completely overwhelmed. They couldn't cope with hundreds of fires raging simultaneously. Water was scarce. Many water pipes had been destroyed by bombs. Roads were littered with debris. People fled burning buildings, seeking refuge in basements and bomb shelters. Panic was widespread. In 90 minutes, approximately 1,455 tons of bombs fell on the city, two-thirds of which were incendiary. By 2:30 a.m., the last bombers had left the target area. The raid was over. The crews headed home, many in shock at what they had seen. Behind them, Cologne burned, illuminating the night sky for dozens of kilometers around. May 31, 1942, 00:47 a.m. The first bomb falls on Cologne. Tens, hundreds, thousands follow. Over the next 90 minutes, 1,455 tons of bombs rain down on the city. Two-thirds of them are incendiary. The rest are heavy, high-explosive bombs designed to destroy buildings and infrastructure. It is the most intense bombing campaign in history to that point. 868 bombers strike the primary target. Another 15 strike secondary ones. The first wave, consisting of experienced crews flying Lancaster, Halifax, and Sterling heavy bombers, dropped high-explosive bombs, massive cylindrical devices weighing up to 4,000 pounds, 1,800 kilos, that the Germans called Luftminen, air mines, and the British called cookies. These bombs did not create deep craters like conventional bombs. Instead, they exploded on the surface or slightly above, creating a massive shockwave that tore off roofs, shattered windows, destroyed walls, and penetrated floors. The purpose of high explosive bombs is to open up buildings, making them vulnerable to the next wave. And that next wave is not long in coming. Following the high explosive bombs are thousands of small incendiary bombs, devices weighing approximately 4 pounds, 1.8 kilos each, filled with thermite or magnesium. These bombs burn at approximately 2200 degrees C, 4300 degrees C, hot enough to burn through metal, melt brick, and ignite virtually any material. They fall like rain, thousands at a time, penetrating deep into destroyed buildings through breached roofs and ceilings. As a result, 2,500 fires broke out in the city. German firefighters classified 1,700 of them as major. These weren't isolated fires, but rather a fiery labyrinth that engulfed entire city blocks. The fires began to coalesce, creating what British planners called a conflagration, a firestorm, a self-sustaining blaze that generated its own winds and became nearly uncontrollable. The mechanics of a firestorm are simple and terrifying. When dozens or hundreds of fires burn close together, they heat the air. Hot air rises, creating a low-pressure area. Cool air from the periphery rushes toward the center of the fire to fill the vacuum. This creates winds, sometimes hurricane force, that feed the fire with oxygen, fan the flames, and carry sparks to new buildings. Temperatures at the center of a firestorm can reach 800, 1,000 degrees C. At such temperatures, people die of suffocation long before the flames reach them. However, a full-blown firestorm did not occur in Cologne. The width of the streets and the efforts of the fire brigade prevented the individual fires from coalescing into a single tornado. But the destruction was enormous. 3,300 non-residential buildings were destroyed, 2,090 were seriously damaged, and 6,420 suffered minor damage, a total of 12,140 buildings, of which 2,560 were industrial or commercial establishments. Among the completely destroyed buildings were 7 administrative buildings, 14 public buildings, 7 banks, 9 hospitals, 17 churches, 16 schools, 4 university buildings, 10 post office and railway buildings, 10 historic buildings, 2 newspaper offices, 4 hotels, 2 movie theaters, and 6 department stores. Military losses included only the anti-aircraft artillery barracks. Industrial losses included 67 enterprises and more than 40 transportation facilities. The housing sector suffered catastrophically. 13,010 apartments were destroyed, 6,360 were seriously damaged, and 22,270 suffered minor damage. This meant that tens of thousands of people lost their homes overnight. According to various estimates, after the raid, between 135,000 and 150,000 of the city's 700,000 residents fled Cologne, becoming refugees. The death toll was relatively small compared to the scale of the destruction. Between 469 and 486 people were killed, 401 of whom were civilians and 58 soldiers. Another 5,027 were wounded. This was significantly fewer than the British planners had expected, who had hoped for thousands of casualties. This was due to the effective air raid shelter system the Germans had built in Cologne. Most residents took refuge in basements or special air raid shelters, which protected them from explosions and fire. Nevertheless, the psychological impact was enormous. The residents of Cologne had never seen anything like it before. Previous raids had been relatively small, dozens of aircraft, a few hours of bombing. Now, nearly 1,000 bombers attacked in 90 minutes. The incessant roar of engines, endless explosions, fire everywhere. Many residents were convinced this was the end, that the city would be completely destroyed. The famous Cologne Cathedral, one of the most famous Gothic cathedrals in the world, was damaged but not destroyed. Several bombs struck it, damaging the roof and some walls, but the main structure remained standing. After the war, The cathedral became a symbol of Cologne's resilience. In photographs of the city's ruins, it rises above the ruined buildings, still standing, still recognizable. Fire crews battled the blaze all night and into the following day. Many fires were extinguished only after several days. The water supply system was severely damaged. Many pipes had been ruptured by bombs. Firefighters had to pump water directly from the Rhine. Roads were littered with debris, making access to some areas difficult. But gradually, the fire was brought under control. On the morning of May 31st, residents who had spent the night in bomb shelters began to emerge. Many didn't recognize their city. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Familiar buildings were gone. The streets were littered with rubble. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of burning. Thousands wandered through the ruins, searching for their homes and loved ones. Some found only ashes. German propaganda attempted to minimize the scale of the disaster. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, ordered newspapers not to publish photographs of the destruction. Official reports spoke of British air piracy terrorism and barbaric attacks on the civilian population, but acknowledged only some material damage. But hiding the truth was impossible. Too many people had witnessed the destruction. Too many had lost their homes. For the British, it was a propaganda victory. They could finally show the world, and the USSR in particular, that they were actively fighting against Germany. They could finally prove that strategic bombing worked. Cologne was burning, and the whole world saw it. While Cologne burned below, the British bombers began their return journey to their bases in England. This was no less dangerous a phase of the operation. German night fighters hunted in the darkness, attempting to intercept the bombers on their return. Anti-aircraft batteries continued to fire. Many bombers were damaged. Some were flying on one engine, with wounded crews, losing altitude. For them, every minute of the flight could be their last. Of the 1,047 bombers that took to the air, 43 were lost, 41 shot down or crashed, and 2 more were lost later. This represented approximately 4.1% of the total number of aircraft participating. By the standards of bomber operations at the time, these were relatively small losses. Typically, raids lost 5 to 10% of their aircraft, and sometimes more. The bomber stream tactic worked. The concentration of aircraft in time and space overwhelmed the German air defense system. However, every downed aircraft meant the loss of a crew, usually 5 to 7. In total, about 300 crew members were killed or missing that night. Some managed to bail out and were captured. Others died in burning aircraft or during crashes. For the RAF, these were acceptable losses statistically, but behind every figure stood real people. Young pilots, navigators, gunners, many of whom were flying combat missions for the first and last time. The bombers began returning to base around 3 or 4 a.m. One by one, they came in for landing. The tired crews disembarked and were debriefed. They were asked, did they hit the target? Did they see fires? How much anti-aircraft fire was there? Did they encounter fighters? The crews described what they saw. Massive fires visible for hundreds of kilometers, continuous anti-aircraft fire, chaos above the target. Many were shocked by the scale of the destruction. Arthur Harris received the first reports early in the morning of May 31st. Reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cologne after the raid took photographs. The photos showed vast areas of destruction, smoke rising thousands of meters, and fires still burning. Harris was pleased. The operation had been a success. 1,000 bombers had performed their mission. Losses were acceptable. The destruction was significant. This proved that carpet bombing was working. But the question remained, how effective were the bombings from a military standpoint? 67 industrial enterprises and more than 40 transport facilities were destroyed. But most of these were small businesses, workshops, and warehouses. Large military factories suffered minimal damage. Military production in Cologne declined, but did not stop. Within a few weeks, most factories resumed operations, often in temporary locations. The railway network was disrupted, but not paralyzed. Several stations and tracks were destroyed, but German engineers quickly restored critical routes. A week after the raid, trains were running through Cologne again, albeit with delays. The Rhine, a major transport artery, was unaffected. It was impossible to bomb a river. The bridges over the Rhine were damaged, but not completely destroyed. The morale of the German population was shaken, but not broken. Many Cologne residents were demoralized, frightened, and desperate. Tens of thousands left the city, becoming refugees. But most remained. Life went on. Shops reopened. Factories resumed operations. Schools resumed classes in surviving buildings. The German economy and society proved remarkably resilient to the bombing. The Nazi government quickly mobilized resources to aid Cologne. Work crews were dispatched to clear the rubble, restore roads, and repair water and electrical systems. Food and clothing distribution centers were set up for the victims. Goebbels personally visited Cologne a few days after the raid, addressed the population, promised revenge on Britain, and called for fortitude. Propaganda exploited the raid to fuel hatred of British terrorists. For Britain, Operation Millennium was a propaganda victory. Newspapers around the world published photographs of Cologne burning under headlines like 1,000 bombers blast Cologne. Winston Churchill congratulated Harris and the Bomber Command crews on the successful operation. In the House of Commons, Churchill declared, "This proves that Britain is not passive. We are striking at the enemy. We are doing it effectively." For the USSR, which was waging bloody battles in the East, Operation Millennium was proof that the Western Allies were not sitting idle. Stalin demanded the opening of a second front in Europe, a ground invasion that would divert German troops from the Eastern Front. But Britain was not ready for such an invasion. Strategic bombing was a way to demonstrate that Britain was actively fighting, that it was contributing to the common struggle against Germany. However, some in the British government and command were skeptical. They doubted that carpet bombing could lead to Germany's surrender. They pointed to the experience of the British Blitz of 1940 and 1941, when German bombing raids, rather than breaking British morale, actually united the nation. Why should the Germans respond any differently? They also pointed to the high cost of bombing operations, aircraft, crews, fuel, bombs, all of which diverted resources from other war needs. But Harris was convinced. Operation Millennium had proven that massive bombing was possible, that casualties could be acceptable, that destruction could be significant. He planned to continue. Cologne was just the beginning. The next targets would be other German cities: Essen, Hamburg, Bremen. The air war was turning into an all-out war against cities. Operation Millennium marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The bomber stream tactic was employed for the first time, and most of its tactics were used throughout the next 2 years of the war, with some elements remaining until its very end. It marked a shift from pinpoint bombing to carpet bombing, from attacks on specific military targets to the destruction of entire cities. Following the success of the Cologne raid, Harris immediately began planning subsequent operations. A second 1,000-bomber operation was launched against Essen on June 1, 1942, but the results were disappointing. Bad weather and cloud cover prevented accurate bombing, with most of the bombs falling short of the city. A third raid against Bremen on June 25-26 also yielded mixed results. It became clear that the 1,000-bomber tactic could not be used regularly. It placed too great a strain on resources. But the basic principle, massive raids using hundreds of bombers, became standard tactics for RAF Bomber Command. Between 1942 and 1945, thousands of raids were carried out on German cities. Some became infamous. The firebombing of Hamburg in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, which created a veritable firestorm and killed approximately 45,000 people. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 which devastated the historic city and killed between 25,000 and 40,000 people. The carpet bombing strategy was based on several assumptions. First, that the destruction of cities would undermine the morale of the German population and force them to demand the government end the war. This assumption proved erroneous. The German population, although suffering from the bombings, did not rebel against the Nazi regime. On the contrary, many Germans rallied behind the government, viewing the Allies as terrorists who were killing civilians. Secondly, the destruction of cities would lead to the collapse of the German war economy. This assumption was partially correct. The bombings did indeed disrupt production, destroy infrastructure, and divert resources from reconstruction and air defense. By 1944, Germany was forced to dedicate about 1 million soldiers and workers to air defense, anti-aircraft batteries, fighter aircraft, searchlights, and radar. These were resources that could not be used at the front. But the German economy proved remarkably resilient. Even after thousands of air raids, production of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition continued to grow until the end of 1944. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, was able to decentralize production, move factories to underground bunkers, and utilize forced labor from prisoners of war and slave laborers from occupied territories. The bombing slowed the German economy, but did not stop it. Third, carpet bombing was the only way the Western Allies could inflict significant damage on Germany before the opening of a second front in 1944. This was partly true. Before the Normandy landings in June 1944, strategic bombing was the primary means by which Britain and the United States could attack Germany directly. It provided a psychological advantage. It showed the USSR that the Western Allies were actively fighting, and it showed the German population that the war was being waged not only on distant fronts, but also at home. But was there an alternative? Could the Allies have focused on pinpoint bombing of specific military targets instead of destroying entire cities? The U.S. Army Air Forces, USAAF, which joined the bombing campaign in 1942, attempted just that. The Americans employed daylight precision bombing tactics, attacking specific factories, oil refineries, and railway junctions. But losses were enormous. German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery shot down dozens of American bombers in each raid. Only after the Americans developed long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang, that could escort bombers to targets deep within Germany, did daytime precision bombing become more effective. By 1944, the combination of British nighttime carpet bombing and American daytime precision bombing created what the Allies called around-the-clock bombing. German cities were bombed day and night, without interruption. The moral question of carpet bombing remained unresolved. Was it justifiable to kill tens or hundreds of thousands of civilians to weaken the enemy's war effort? Arthur Harris defended his strategy to the end of his life. He argued that carpet bombing saved lives in the long run by shortening the war, that it was justifiable retaliation for the German bombing of British cities, and that there is no civilian population in a total war. His critics argued that carpet bombing was a war crime, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people without achieving any significant military effect. After the war, Harris was not granted a peerage, unlike other British commanders. This was a tacit admission that the British government was distancing itself from the carpet bombing strategy. Winston Churchill, who had approved Operation Millennium and supported Harris throughout the war, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The question arises whether it was necessary to bomb German cities on such a scale in the last months of the war. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious consideration against the Allied bombing campaign. Operation Millennium and the bombing of Cologne ushered in the era of total air warfare against cities. This approach was used not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific, where American B-29s bombed Japanese cities with incendiary bombs, creating firestorms that killed tens of thousands of people. The culmination came with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a logical continuation of the strategy of destroying entire cities to force the enemy to surrender. The bombing of Cologne was a shock to the German command and the population. German cities had been hit by airstrikes before, but nothing on the scale of Operation Millennium. Adolf Hitler was furious. Hermann Göring, who had promised that not a single enemy bomb would fall on German soil, was humiliated. The people of Cologne and other cities began to realize that the war had come to their homes. The German command was forced to reassess its air defense system. It became clear that the existing system, known as the Kamm-Huber line, was unable to cope with massive air raids. Developed by Major General Joseph Kamm-Huber, this system relied on a network of radar stations and interception zones, where night fighters were directed by ground controllers to individual bombers. The system was effective against small groups of bombers, but the bomber stream tactic overwhelmed it. The Germans began adapting their tactics. New interception methods were developed, including wild sow, wild boar, a tactic in which single-engine fighters would fly over the target during a raid and attack the bombers, using the light of fires below for visual detection. They also developed the Zame Sow, tame boar tactic, in which twin-engine night fighters equipped with radar would follow the bomber stream and attack individual aircraft. Anti-aircraft artillery was reinforced. By 1943, Germany had over 10,000 heavy anti-aircraft guns protecting cities and industrial facilities. These were resources that could have been used at the front. Every 80mm anti-aircraft gun was also an effective anti-tank weapon, but they were needed at home for defense against bombers. By the end of the war, about 1 million people were employed in the air defense system: soldiers, technicians, observers, radar operators, and searchlight operators. The civil defense system was expanded and improved. After Cologne, it became clear that every major city needed a comprehensive network of air raid shelters, sufficient to protect the entire population. Thousands of bunkers, fortified basements, and underground shelters were built. The population was trained in how to act during an air raid alarm, where to take cover, how to extinguish incendiary bombs, and how to provide first aid. Fire brigades were strengthened and better equipped. Industrial production was decentralized. Albert Speer, who became Minister of Armaments in 1942, realized that concentrating production in large factories made the economy vulnerable to bombing. He initiated a program of dispersal, moving production from large cities to small towns, villages, and underground bunkers. Parts for a single tank or aircraft were produced at dozens of different factories and then assembled on a final assembly line. This made the system more resilient to bombing. Propaganda also adapted. Joseph Goebbels used the bombings to fuel hatred of the Allies, portraying them as terrorists, deliberately killing German women and children. Posters showed destroyed houses, dead children, and crying mothers, with captions like, "This is being done by Anglo-American terrorists," or "Revenge will be ours." Propaganda called for total mobilization and even greater efforts at the front and in the home front. Interestingly, the bombings had an unexpected psychological effect. Instead of breaking morale, they sometimes strengthened resolve. Many Germans who had previously been indifferent to the war, or even critical of the Nazi regime, now rallied around the government in the face of terror from the air. This was similar to what happened in Britain during the Blitz. The bombings didn't break the British, but rather united them. Human psychology proved more complex than bombing strategists had imagined. However, the bombing did have a cumulative effect on German society and the economy. By 1944-1945, after thousands of air raids, many German cities were in ruins. Tens of thousands of people were killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, and millions made homeless. The transportation system was seriously disrupted. Railways, bridges, and roads were destroyed. Coal mining and synthetic fuel production declined. Steel and aluminum production was disrupted. By the end of the war, Germany was exhausted. The Nazi leadership issued increasingly desperate orders, mobilizing teenagers and the elderly into the Volkssturm, People's Militia, using up the last fuel reserves for offensives that were doomed to fail. Bombing was one factor in this exhaustion. It wasn't the only one. The Eastern Front, where Germany was losing millions of soldiers, was a far more significant factor. But bombing did contribute. After Operation Millennium, bombing raids became regular. During the war, Cologne was subjected to 262 air raids, more than any other German city. By the end of the war, the city was approximately 80% destroyed. Of its pre-war population of approximately 700,000, only about 40,000 remained by 1945. The city was dead. The bombing of Cologne on May 30th, 1942, marked a watershed in the history of aerial warfare. It was the moment when air warfare transformed from a tool to support ground operations into an independent strategy of destruction. It was the moment when the line between military and civilian targets was finally erased. It was the moment when technology, the ability to launch 1,000 bombers, changed the very concept of war. Operation Millennium proved that massive bombing was possible, that casualties were acceptable, and that destruction could be significant. This paved the way for escalation, to even larger raids, to even more devastating bombings. Cologne was only the beginning. It was followed by Hamburg, where in July 1943, a veritable firestorm was created, killing approximately 45,000 people. Then Berlin, which was bombed regularly from 1943 to 1945. Then Dresden in February 1945, when the historic city was obliterated in a matter of hours. The same logic was applied in the Pacific. American B-29s bombed Japanese cities with incendiary bombs, creating firestorms. Tokyo, bombed in March 1945, lost approximately 100,000 people in a single night. The culmination came with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a logical continuation of the strategy of destroying entire cities in a single blow. The route from Cologne to Hiroshima was direct. Was the carpet bombing strategy effective? This question remains controversial to this day. On the one hand, the bombings disrupted the German economy, diverted enormous resources to air defense, demoralized the population, and destroyed transportation infrastructure. After the war, the Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted by the U.S. government, concluded that the bombing significantly weakened Germany and shortened the war. On the other hand, the German economy continued to function until the very end of the war. Production of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition continued to grow until the end of 1944. The morale of the German population was unbroken. There were no mass uprisings, no demands for surrender. Germany capitulated only when Soviet troops entered Berlin and the Western Allies crossed the Rhine. Ground operations, not bombing, decided the outcome of the war. The moral question remains unresolved. Was the killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians justified? Post-war studies have shown that approximately 600,000 German civilians were killed by Allied bombing. Millions more were wounded or made homeless. Were these sacrifices necessary for victory? Or was it an excessive, disproportionate use of force? Arthur Harris defended his strategy to the end of his life. In his memoirs, published in 1947, he wrote, "In total war, the enemy uses his entire population for military purposes. Therefore, the entire population becomes a legitimate military target. We did not attack women and children. We attacked the war economy that depended on them." His critics argued that this was a rationalization of mass murder, that alternatives existed, and that precision bombing of specific military targets could have been focused. After the war, Britain distanced itself from the carpet bombing strategy. Harris was not granted a peerage like other commanders. A memorial to bomber command crews was not erected until 2012, 67 years after the war's end. This reflected the moral discomfort of British society over what had been done. Bomber command crews had carried out orders, and many of them died. More than 55,000 crew members were killed, the highest casualty rate of any Allied service. but the strategy they served remained controversial. Operation Millennium and the firebombing of Cologne changed the nature of war. They demonstrated that technology could create destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. 1,000 bombers could obliterate a city in a single night. 20 years later, a single atomic bomb could do the same. The logic was the same: destroy enemy cities, kill the enemy population, break the enemy's will to resist. This logic didn't disappear with the end of World War II. The Cold War was based on the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. If one side attacked, the other would destroy its cities with nuclear weapons. Thousands of nuclear warheads were aimed at cities on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Operation Millennium was the harbinger of this era, an era when entire cities could be destroyed in hours or minutes. Today, 8 decades after the bombing of Cologne, the ruins have been cleared and the city rebuilt. Cologne Cathedral stands as a symbol of resilience. But the memory of that night in May 1942 remains. Cologne's museums display photographs of the destruction, testimonies of survivors, and bomb remnants. Every year on the anniversary of the raid, memorial ceremonies are held. The bombing of Cologne was more than just a military operation. It was an experiment that demonstrated how technology had changed war forever. It was the moment when the boundaries between front and rear, between soldiers and civilians, between war and terror, were erased. It was the moment when war became total, when entire societies became battlefields. And this experiment succeeded from a technical standpoint. 1,000 bombers could destroy a city. But its success opened the way to even more devastating wars, to an era when humanity gained the ability to destroy itself. Sometimes eras are changed not by laws or treaties, but by a flash in the night sky. Operation Millennium was such a flash, the moment when the world entered a new era of total war.